Good afternoon, Mark Sudduth, HurricaneTrack.com here with your hurricane outlook and discussion for Monday, October 17th, 2016. Let's take a look at the sea surface temperature anomalies for today, updated this afternoon, so very timely. You notice in the equatorial Pacific, the signature of a La Nina starting to come on even stronger. Probably get to weak La Nina conditions throughout the wintertime, and then we will monitor that throughout 2017 to see if it hangs around for the 2017 hurricane season, but that is obviously way down the road. You also notice cooler in the Northeast Pacific as a whole. A lot of blues showing up here. The PDO, or Pacific, boy, I just can't talk today. The Pacific Decadal Oscillation starting to go down, and that's just a fancy way of saying that overall the Pacific Ocean is getting a little cooler, while the AMO, or the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, remains just a little bit on the warm side overall. And you can see that pretty clearly. Very warm anomalies here in the Northwest Atlantic, fairly warm in the Northeast Atlantic. Still have this sort of cold area in the middle, but that's fairly typical. Warm to right around where it should be in the main development region, and very much above normal in the Northwest Caribbean, and especially the western Gulf of Mexico. So when you add it all up, the Atlantic is still favorable, and the Pacific, at least in the eastern Pacific, things are starting to cool off a little bit. So that'll be interesting as we move through the winter, and then of course, as I alluded to, maybe next year's hurricane season, but we'll worry about that many months away. All right, so the ocean heat content certainly still there in the Atlantic Basin, and even off the southeast coast here in the wake of Matthew, still fairly high upper ocean heat content for this time of year. The highest levels concentrated, of course, in the Caribbean, but there's still respectable amounts of energy in the southwest Atlantic. Even though Matthew put a dent in that, the Atlantic is so warm that even that large sprawling hurricane going through there didn't remove all of the upper ocean heat content through upwelling, like a motorboat churning through. It helped a little bit. In fact, let's go back to the anomaly chart. You can see right through here Matthew's path for the most part, and there's Nicole in its path, and it's riding up here over parts of the Gulf Stream and still hanging on tight. We'll talk about that more in a moment. But this upper ocean heat content is important because this is the fuel in the upper part of the ocean, and the 80-degree line, or the isotherm, goes pretty far down into the ocean's depths, relatively speaking, especially in this area. And that's what that means when you have warm water extending just beyond, not just at the surface, but beyond the surface, way deep, sometimes several hundred meters. Then you have lots and lots of fuel for tropical cyclones to tap into. So what's happening out there today, this afternoon? We still have Nicole, a hurricane, way up north here, north of 40 degrees latitude, setting all kinds of records for October. Then we have a disturbance down here that'll eventually be our next area of interest or invest. 60% chance for development, and it looks like this is going to go and eventually become Otto, O-T-T-O. That'll be our 15th name storm, if my math serves. We've had 5 or 6 hurricanes, something like that. Alex was in January. I still think that was an anomaly. And we've had 3 major hurricanes, so we're just a little bit above the long-term average. Our ACE score getting close to 130, if not already. So the season has, I think, outdone itself for the most part, slightly above the long-term average, and certainly with these 3 major hurricanes and with Matthew reaching Cat 5, the season perhaps has overachieved just a little bit. Here's a historic look at Nicole from our own tracking map system. Started out here when Matthew was still hanging around, did a little bit of a loop, turned around, crossed over Bermuda, and then sitting up here as a hurricane, and it'll eventually move on out over colder water someday here and weaken and become a much larger extratropical storm over the Atlantic. And it will continue to send out these swells that'll radiate from the center, coming all the way down into the Caribbean and the East Coast. So you guys want to get your surfboards ready, but be careful out there. Some of these swells are going to be pretty significant. So just be careful out there. The water temperatures are still warm enough to enjoy it. but just be mindful that that's a lot of energy being translated into the ocean by that hurricane. And the hemispheric shot really shows you better. There's the hurricane, there's the eye. Kind of has a little front associated with it, but still, I guess, classified as a hurricane. I don't know if that's so much a front as it is more like a tail, maybe pulling in. We'll call it a large feeder band for now, all right? But it does look like a comma to me. It's transitioning. It'll get there. But still, the central core of it here is still very much hurricane-esque. So I don't have any problem with it still being classified as a hurricane. This is the area we'll be watching in the southwest Atlantic. Still have an active tropical wave coming off. This will move all the way over. Maybe something to watch over here in 10 to 12 days, maybe more. And then the eastern Pacific calming down as it normally does. This area here, of no concern. It was kind of mentioned by the Hurricane Center, but really no worries. I don't want to ignore what's happening in the Pacific, especially when the Atlantic doesn't have any life-threatening situations going on. A couple of typhoons here, and this one right here, Haima, I think that's how you say it, probably going to go either right over the northern tip or just north of there, of Luzon in the Philippines. And the closer this gets, though, obviously the farther south it tracks, the more of an issue it is. Manila, tucked in here somewhere, so hopefully it'll stay far enough north of that big population center and maybe even thread the needle here between Taiwan and the northern Philippines, but then it's a problem for China. But this typhoon, Haima, is going to be very, very powerful, probably peaking out at close to 180 miles an hour, if not higher. This region out here, the super typhoons line up. It's unbelievable the amount of energy that's available in the vastness of the Pacific Basin. And so, folks are going to want to watch that closely. There's a typhoon chaser there, James Reynolds. Look him up on Twitter. He's based in Hong Kong, I believe. And he goes all over the Western Pacific, does a fantastic job documenting these beasts. And maybe Josh Morgerman, you know him as iCyclone, will head out there depending on where this makes landfall. So lots of people interested in this stuff, and it is fascinating. It's just too bad that they cause so much misery when they encounter land. If we could only mitigate against their effects and eliminate loss of life down to zero, then we could perhaps celebrate them a little bit more for what they are. And I'm serious about that. Without hurricanes and typhoons, the weather on planet Earth would just be miserable. You'd have this buildup of heat that just wouldn't be tolerable, and you have to get rid of it. And tropical cyclones are a good mechanism, not necessarily taking it out of the atmosphere, but kind of redistributing the heat from the oceans to the atmosphere that way, because, they feed off that warm water. And I'm getting on a soapbox here, but, they are amazing pieces of how the global heat balance works. And it really is too bad that they cause pain and suffering, especially in the poorer countries that live close to, where people live close to the ocean. It's tough because you're so fascinated in them, at least I am. And then you have to deal, certainly, with the emotion of what they do to people. It's no good. All right, so back on topic here, the GFS indicating more aggressive. There it is there, the GFS ensemble members. Fairly aggressive. I mean, look at that. Amplification of the Madden-Julian oscillation into phase 8 by week 2. But the Euro says, no, I don't think so. And it's a lot less amplified, which this will probably end up being right. And we might see a little bit of an MJO, but probably nothing like what the GFS and its ensemble members are indicating. So let's take a look at the global forecast system. Speaking of the GFS, 5,000 foot level, or 850 millibars in the atmosphere. There's our nice heat ridge for October. I'm right here in southeast North Carolina. All these river basins up here can dry out some and drain into the sounds and the intracoastal waterways and etc., to hopefully let these people try to get back to, well, they're not even close to returning to normal. They still have to dry out and assess things. It's just been a major disaster, something we'll talk about more in a different forum later on, perhaps. But let's look at the setup here. This is the next 5 days, and I want you to pay attention. I'm going to speed it up a little bit. So this little bit of energy down here is kind of elongated. You see that? It's sort of egg-shaped. And will it hatch, to use that analogy a little further? Well, it tries to. The energy is still spread out. You remember how many times I've showed you this particular chart throughout the season, and we look for something to be round and not amorphic like this kind of looks. But then wait, as we get towards about day 3, it tries to finally consolidate here, and I'll stop it for just a moment. And this looks like a fairly decent tropical cyclone, maybe subtropical, meaning that the winds and energy is spread out over a larger area, not quite as concentrated. But by day 3, this does look like it tries to develop into something, and then it finally starts to move off to the north and east, because we have this trough coming in that would basically boot it and catch it out. If it was negatively tilted coming in this way, it could pinwheel it in, capture it, and bring it up the east coast, but it doesn't look like that will happen. So more wave action, more beach erosion along the southeast from that system, and again, if it does get going, its name will be Otto, O-T-T-O. One more time, I'll look at the evolution of it, hanging around, kind of, like I said, weird looking in the vorticity field, but then, right there at the end, it tries to get its act together, and it'll probably be our 15th named storm of the 2016 season. Something to keep an eye on, but I don't think it'll be an issue for land directly. That could change, you never know, but so far so good. And we don't need any more landfalls this year along the east coast, for sure. And, we can't rule out that something could happen beyond week 2 down in the Caribbean and maybe end up in the Gulf of Mexico. I don't see anything that shows that, but with the water temperatures above normal and the way the season has been, and it's like October is the new September, you just never know. Maybe November will be like October. It's going to be interesting. It really will. And then that makes the hurricane off-season even shorter, it seems. November to May will go by very fast. So, wow, a lot to keep up with. Have a great rest of your Monday. As always, thanks for tuning in. Good to be back in the office doing these videos. Took a little time off to just reflect on things and prepare some projects for launch soon. Always working on things behind the scenes, but nevertheless, great to be back in and working on stuff as we watch the tropics. Mark Sudduth, HurricaneTrack.com. Thanks as always for your time and attention. I'll be back with you again tomorrow.